Good evening, friends. Welcome to everyone. I'm Rabbi Denise Ager from Congregation Kol Ami in West Hollywood, and we're delighted to welcome you tonight to a really important presentation on mental health in the time of COVID-19. This is a second in a series of medical and health updates that have been presented by our congregation, and I'm delighted tonight that you've joined us to talk about a really most serious issue as we here in California are in the 13th week of shelter in place. And that brings up lots of issues for all of us. Even if we're physically doing well, the challenges and stresses and anxieties of living in a time of pandemic and living in a time when there's been uprisings and protests and national disturbance and stress, creates difficult living situations for all of us, including the now that we are in our society starting to open up. And that brings a whole other set of worries, anxieties, and stressors. And so it's important for us to pay attention to our total well-being, our health and welfare, not just our physical, but our emotional, psychological, and mental well-being. And so tonight, we're living out our highest Jewish values by taking into consideration the notion of shleimut, of completeness, of wholeness, and that we're addressing the well-being of each and every one of us. And so I'm really delighted to welcome two longtime Congregation Kol Ami members who have incredible expertise in this area of mental health and emotional and psychological health. And so I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Ricki Bander. Ricki's a longtime Temple member. She is a psychologist in private practice, and she is also a coach and coach trainer. Her PhD is from Ohio State University, and she has more than 25 years of organizational consulting and executive training. She has been a clinical associate professor of family medicine and the associate director of faculty development and behavioral science training for USC PIH Family Medicine. And she continues today not only in private practice with individuals, but she works so closely with helping medical professionals deal with their mental health and well-being, particularly as they are working in hospital and clinical settings, and particularly during this time of the coronavirus. So thank you, Ricki, for being with us. And also with us tonight, no stranger to leading things at Kol Ami, is Larry Levi, who's a marriage and family therapist. Larry is in private practice. He's also trained as a somatic experiencing practitioner, which specializes in healing traumas from a traumatic childhood. He has done incredible work in group support, particularly in grief support, and he's co-led with me 2 grief groups at our congregation, and most recently Larry and I co-facilitated together at the beginning of our shelter in place back in March and early April a quarantine quorum, as we called it, for dealing with the anxieties and fears that we had as we entered quarantine. So I'm delighted to welcome both of you to this presentation and to helping us learn how to take better care of ourselves so that we can thrive during this time. And so first, Ricki's going to present to us, and then Larry. And if you have any questions, we're going to take your Q&A tonight. We'll ask you to write your questions in the Q&A function. This is a webinar, different than a regular Zoom room you might have been in. Please don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A, and we promise we're leaving time at the end for your questions, comments, and concerns. So with that, Ricki, if you will share your presentation first, and then we'll have Larry follow with his specialty in trauma, and we'll continue on from there.
Thank you, Rabbi. And let's see if it works. It's not going. There we go. Everybody up and running?
We are good.
We're good.
Okay. So as you can see, I am looking for the next little clip. Is this the arrow? Yes, I hope so. Basically, when I work with physicians, I'm working with people who constantly have to be at the top of their game, who can't afford to make mistakes. And if they do, they have to get right back on the horse and ride again. And that's kind of the position we're all in today. We're all looking at how can we best manage all of our anxiety, keep moving forward, and take our lives from just getting by into thriving and flourishing. Most of us felt like we were living a good life before and want to continue doing that. And that's what our well-being and our mental health is truly all about. So let's see if we can go to the next slide. And I'm getting end show. That's not good. Let's see if it goes this way. No. There we go. No. I'm not getting the next slide up.
Well, just slide down. You've moved out of the slideshow. Just you'll have this next. Just hit your next slide on your thumbnail.
That's what I'm going to do. Okay, so when we talk about, I'm going back one. When we talk about health, the first thing to know is what the World Health Organization said some years ago, and that is simply health is not just the absence of disease. Health is about overall functioning in multiple facets of our life. It's our physical health, it's our emotional health, it's our relationships, it's our sense of purpose in life, it's how our mind and our cognitive works are going. As we do that, we're really looking at how do we as a person maximize our potential, minimize the risks that would stop us from meeting our potential. We look at if there's an injury, if there's a problem that we run into in our lives that takes us off that top of the game, as I mentioned, then how do we recover? How do we center ourselves? How do we regain our focus? And how do we move on, move through it? We talk about that as moving through adversity, and typically it's called resilience. Resilience is, as we're going to discuss today, made up of various pieces of mental health and emotional function. Our mental health is not, as is so often referred to, a combination of psychiatric factors or a list of disorders. Mental health is not defined by a diagnosis. Mental health is defined by how you process the information and the data that you're receiving all throughout the day. Mostly what we're talking about here is our mental health when we're stressed. For all of us, stress can be either negative or positive. How you interpret it is really a personal thing. So for example, we always go to that glass is half full, glass is half empty. And some people just see the glass as an opportunity to take a drink. And that's a much more neutral way of looking at it. It's just a glass of water, however much is in there. And all of that is governed by your emotional response to it. How we acknowledge and express our emotions is either through a healthy or an unhealthy lens, through our stress level or how we handle stress, which becomes distress. If we've been working under stress for a long time, then our immune system starts to fall apart a bit and we get dis-ease instead of ease. You have dysfunction. And you see in the slide a bunch of the words and the word dis in front, meaning you can be regulated, dysregulated. Dysregulated would mean I'm having palpitations, so my mouth is dry, and I can't slow down enough to think straight. As people, we generally move in three directions. One is to avoid harm, one is to approach rewards, and the other is to connect to others. Some common examples of how we might do those things in healthy or unhealthy ways. You talk about people who are attached at the hip. There's no room for separation. There's no sense of the individual. And if you're a child, attachment like that may be appropriate. As an adult, we start to talk about codependency, and you start to see those dysfunctional kinds of patterns. So how do you know when that stress or distress is becoming harmful to you? And it's really keying in to your own responses. And you're going to hear me talk at length about self-reflection as we go through this. Some of the signs right off the top are distorted thinking, negativity, feeling like you can't get a clear thought, you've lost your ability to focus, you're in a brain fog, And of course, when your activities of daily living, your personal hygiene fall apart, you're not sleeping well, if you find yourself withdrawing, and as I mentioned before, all those physical symptoms any of us can encounter. One of the models that I like us to really focus in on is that all these stressors can also lead to growth. There's a lot of opportunity to be had when we're stressed and when we're distressed, especially if we step into those healthier functions that promote our well-being. So there are some models for it, and you're going to see the words post-traumatic up here a lot. We're in the middle of a pandemic, or maybe not even the middle. We're at the beginning, depending on who you talk to, what scientists you listen to. And so I want you to sort of think of the word post in parentheses as I'm talking, but know that the models come from post-traumatic stress and growth. And as I move into that, you'll see there's a reference there. If people do want to read more, I come from an academic background, so you'll see those there occasionally. Post-traumatic stress historically refers to what we call big T events. Big T events are typically events that are outside the realm of what we would call regular, routine, normal human experience. And you can see the definition up there: violent or accidental death, threat of death. And the examples include being at war, natural disasters. But I would add, in today's environment, that a big T event would be somebody who barely survived COVID, maybe was vented for weeks at a time, didn't expect to live through it. Also with the people that I work with, the physicians, the nurses, the folks on the front line, witnessing the casualties, and that sometimes appears as resources are overwhelmed or disease is just transmitted. So those are some of the big T events today. Let me get to the next. We also have what we would call small T events. And those, my screen is not scrolling up for me to be able to get down. Let's see what we can do here. Let's see if I can get to my next slide. I can't get it to go.
That's we're on the small T one.
Yeah, but I can't get to the next slide is the problem. The small T events are smaller events, and those are oftentimes things that you run into in a routine basis, but they're upending. They challenge your core beliefs. They're not things you desire. And I would suggest that many of the daily routines that had to be reestablished, some that were lost, are during this pandemic small T events. They're life-altering in and of themselves. They do lead to anxiety and emotional pain. In some instances, as Larry's going to talk about, they're going to bring us back to prior traumas. Some good examples on the hard side of the small T events are lost lives, are funerals you can't attend, the loss in lifestyle, the loss of a job. But there's also some positives that are still small T events. You have more time at home with family. Now that has plus sides and negatives to it, I realize, but for a lot of people, that's something that they've really been able to enjoy. Time with children when they're always busy traveling or at work. So stress, as I said before, can be a positive, can be a negative. Now let's see if I can bring up my next slide. There we go. So again, remember, put that word post in parentheses, and we're talking about how do you grow through these stressful, difficult, challenging times. How do you build that resilience? It's normal to feel the anxiety and the grief, but there's also a set of strengths that you come with. There's a set of past experiences that you previously weathered, and you can look back on how you did that and rely upon those skills, those strengths, and those tools. One of the things I encourage is that you look at some questions just for yourself. And if you want to take a screenshot, I know this is being recorded, but you're welcome to take screenshots and answer some of these questions for yourself, because they do promote your growth. And what's going to work for you is different than what's going to work for your best friend, your children, your spouses, and so on. Growth comes out of positivity, and positivity means reflecting on your appreciation of life. So what is it? What is it that you're appreciating now in this period of time? What would shift your perspective or renew it a little bit? As I said before, reflect back on what your strengths have been. Which ones are getting stronger? Which ones are working? Which ones maybe need to be given up? What new opportunities have emerged? And I'll say for myself, I've never done a webinar before. I've been in the audience, but I've never given one. And now I'm developing a skill, and that's a good thing. Looking at your relationship with other people. How are they getting better? How are they changing? Are you finding out there's some people you can rely on? Some people who interpreted social distance as physical distance and nothing more than that, and somehow you're talking to them more, you're having deeper conversation. And similarly, what's changing in your spiritual life, in your sense of purpose. It's really important to develop a roadmap for how you want to manage yourself. And that way, as you run into some of the stressors, some of the tougher moments, some of the harder decisions, you get to look and say, what do I know will work for me here? What would calm me down here? What do I need to do for me today? So again, that's looking back not just on strengths, but on the techniques that you already know are great for your own personal stress management. Related to that too is some of the other actions we talk about today in terms of mitigating the stress of the pandemic. And that's truly, and you've probably all heard this one before, limiting your media consumption. For some people, they like to say, well, I'm a news junkie, I can't do that. And my advice is always, you don't have to not hear anything, but pick a few times a day that will be yours to take in new information, to hear what's going on. Pick a favorite show or broadcast journalist that you want to hear and stick with that. We're going to talk more about the gratitude journal in a minute and counting your blessing. And of course, you heard through all of the talks and all of the PR releases that came out, spend time outdoors, spend time in nature. We know, and in the field of positive psychology, we talk all the time about nature is healing. The number one technique that anybody can use to calm themselves is deep breathing. The expression in our language, take a breath, that goes really far. As I said before, and as the rabbi mentioned, I work with physicians all the time. And one thing we know doctors do before they walk into the next room, they take a breath. And it just helps you to, I say, blow off the stress. And we say, blow it off. I'm going to blow off an engagement. I'm going to relax. I take a deep breath. Breathing is your friend. Breathing is your number one tool. Please, everybody, take a breath right now. When we talk about how the body works, we also have to talk about how stress impacts our physiology. And really what that means is how stress impacts our central nervous system. And we talk about, and everybody's heard, adrenaline and the fight or flight reaction. When we're talking about stress, we're talking about those things that deplete us, that drain us. And you can see here in this little chart, diagram, pie chart, whatever you want to call it, how if you're on the left side, the negative emotion side, not only does your performance fall off, but your cortisol level, which is referred to as the stress hormone, increases, and DHEA decreases. These are typically the emotions listed there, the emotions that you would encounter. And what do we talk about in the pandemic? We talk about feeling hopeless. We talk about feeling depressed, despair, overwhelmed, anxiety, frustration, worry. So you can go right down that list. But think about the things that you're saying to yourself, the things that you're activity-wise worrying about, and start to list them as the drains. And just think about one thing you might be able to do that moves you more in that positive direction, gives you a sense of spiritedness, a sense of renewal, a sense maybe of a little bit of ease. You don't have to take a big step to get there. And as you move across into the more positive, you start to bring down the hormones that are in fact impacting your health and your overall sense of immunity, feelings of immunity, and true immunity. As I said before, breathing's the number one thing you can do to help yourself. These are just some apps, and of course there are things too that aren't listed here. And if you have one already that works for you, stick with it. But these are some simple ones. At the very bottom, you'll see the 4-7-8 breath and doing it 3 times. You can do it 5 times. It really doesn't matter. Just taking the time to do it. You inhale for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 7, and exhale for a count of 8. And do that a few times, and gets the blood moving through the body, gets you to relax. It can help you fall asleep. It can help you recenter yourself. It'll help you clear your mind. We also move into an area frequently when we're anxious where we start to distort things. We overgeneralize. We talk about things in all or nothing terms, and we begin to view a rare occurrence as a likelihood. So I've been driving for 50 years. And if I have an accident tomorrow, I could easily say, I am the worst driver in the world. I shouldn't have a license. Somebody take it away from me. Maybe I should even turn it into the DMV. That would be an overgeneralization. It would be far more nurturing and soothing to say, wow, this is the first time I've had an accident. I really have to be more careful. I'm so sorry it happened. I'm glad nobody was injured. All of those kinds of statements are sticking to the matter at hand and not distorting what I'm feeling, but letting me, in fact, nurture and care for myself. It's very important when we're in a time of such high stress to show compassion towards yourself. The other thing that tends to happen is we catastrophize, believing things are worse than they are. So again, I know myself best of all, so I use examples from my own life. I'm an asthmatic. And if I started wheezing tomorrow, it would be so easy to go to, oh my God, I'm infected. And if I'm infected, I'm going to die. Catastrophizing. First of all, the odds are it's my asthma. And so if I just stay grounded, if I just stay focused, if I take a few of those breaths, I calm my system and bring myself back to reality. And that's what I've been talking about, is how we correct these distortions. So one thing you can always do, and that's kind of what I was doing with the asthma example, is how would I know for sure that this is COVID as opposed to my asthma? Well, I might take a puff on my inhaler and see, wow, I feel a lot better. That was asthma. When we go through these scenarios and these situations, it's really important to say, how is my reaction? How is my emotional response here really helping me? And if it's not, what can I do to change it? What evidence do I have that this reaction is true? How do I know? What proof is there? And if this is the case, what do I know about myself that would let me handle it, let me get through this? Again, reflecting on those strengths. And the single most important thing always is, what can I learn from a situation? Not what can I do to panic more in it, but what can I learn from it? One of the things that many of us are guilty of is thinking, well, I'll just prepare myself for anything and everything that's going to happen. And that's what we call anticipatory anxiety. And most of us do that by way of what-ifing. So instead of accepting a situation, we say, well, what if this other set of conditions came about? Then what would I do? And we go on, and it keeps us stuck right where we are, anticipating the worst and not even getting to a place where we can hope for the best. So what we want to do is stop the what ifs. And these are just some key steps. I'm going to talk more in a second about the emotional agility step. But the bottom line with all of it is that it always starts with accepting what you cannot change. And I believe it's the serenity prayer that comes really into play here. And if you don't know the serenity prayer, it's easy to Google, but the gist of it is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, right? That's the opening line. And we go on from there, and we're going to get through the rest of it. But the foundation is always accepting what you cannot change. It is what it is, as my 92-year-old mother likes to say. Being present and non-judgmental. We refer to that oftentimes today as be here, be mindful, be present. Keep a sense of humor. Know that you can adapt to a situation. Remain hopeful. And as I said before, have compassion for yourself. People often ask me, what does that mean, have compassion for myself? When I'm in a situation where I'm filled with self-criticism and I'm having a hard time being kind to Ricki and you're having a hard time being kind to you, ask yourself, what would you do for a friend right now who came in with the same set of feelings, with the same conversation? What would you advise them? What would you say to them? And that's what self-compassion is about. Emotional agility, as Susan David explains in her book, also starts with gentle acceptance. She basically does this by laying out a pyramid. So if you think gentle acceptance is the wide base of the pyramid, and then each of these steps goes up until you get to the peak, which is wisdom. That's not to say that you have to move through layer upon layer and you only get to wisdom one time, or gentle acceptance once, and you're not looking at discrete steps. This is really about building new routines, being brave enough to let go of old things that no longer work, set up new ones for yourself. And there are going to be moments where you're moving up the ladder, so to speak, and moments where you come back down because you run into a new situation and you start again. And that's what agility is about. It's developing the ability to go back and forth, in and out. And of course, when we talk about the courage to reset, we're talking about doing things that are useful to you, are developing a new normal. But it's also about letting go of the old things. I said earlier we would return to the gratitude journal and appreciations. And one of the things we know that builds well-being and a sense of happiness, and most of us human beings are after happiness in our life, is to recognize the good things. One of the simplest practices for getting there is to develop a 3 good things journal. I recommend doing it each night before bed. You write down simply 3 gifts, 3 blessings from the day that you are grateful for. But it generally takes about 12 weeks to develop a habit. So if you really want to get positivity going and you really want to begin to be appreciative and grateful, start doing that on a routine basis, not just before bed, but 3 or 4 times in the course of the day. Just stop, take that breath, and think of something that right then and there you're grateful for. It could be as simple as you had a chance to go to the restroom. It could be I had a drink of water. It could be I just spoke to somebody I haven't spoken to in years, but just think of what that might be for you. One of the other parts of our well-being and foundational in our mental health is relationships. It's social connection. And as you've seen throughout this webinar so far, your relationships and social distancing does not mean and should not mean emotional distancing. In fact, we know that longevity is related to our social ties, to our connections, to our sense of community. And at this time, it becomes even more important. So one of the things, again, that I encourage everybody to do, even if you're living with someone that you trust and you confide in, is also think about who are the other people, who are the folks that you can turn to in your life? Who are you giving permission to call you out, to say, you don't look like you're doing so well. I haven't heard from you. What's going on? Somebody who can literally say the negatives that you might not want to hear, but remember, you've given them permission. And what standards are you using as you go forth during the reopening? What are you going to hold yourself to? What are you going to hold others to? And how will you communicate to them? If you don't communicate, you can't expect people to know. And if they don't know, they're liable to push past your boundary. And then you're going to feel angry, disrespected. And will you talk about that? If you want those relationships to remain emotionally healthy, you also have to open that door to communication. All in all, it comes back to how will you be caring for yourself and what are the routines and rituals that work for you? To get through this pandemic, since we don't know when it will end, we have to continuously be on our toes, that's the agility piece, to reset and build new routines, new rituals that help us to get through things we cannot control. In order to do that, you have to know your risk tolerance, and what the challenges are for you. If you're somebody who has a history of using substances to get by when you're anxious, and you know you're at risk for relapse, this is the time to engage with maybe a sponsor, attend more meetings, a therapist that you've worked with. All of us have to look at what we know about ourselves and what's the best way to manage what have been our challenge areas in the past and the new ones as they come about. We also need to look and see if we're living according to our values, our beliefs. We have to see if our expectations are realistic. Of course, at the base of anyone's self-care is nutrition, sleep, and exercise. Sleep is the #1 driver of our health. More and more research points to the need for sleep. An adequate amount of sleep for you may be different than for the person next door. Most adults need somewhere between 6.5 and 9 hours. Some say beyond 9 hours that can actually have a negative impact. Exercise, of course, has been proven time and time again, and we know nutrition is foundational to our health as well. Purpose and spirituality, part of our well-being is knowing what we believe in and living true to those values. When we start to deviate from them, we start to have what I call schisms or gaps between who we are and who we want to be. And those drive their own sense of stress, distress, disease. So it's very important, even sometimes if it entails sacrifice or a difficult decision, that we remain true to who we are, because that's where our inner peace will actually come from. As I mentioned before, we all have to focus on what is our risk tolerance. This pandemic really entails a lot of challenges that have risk. At a certain level, nothing is safe. And I'm not saying that to scare anybody, panic anybody, or create more anxiety. There are epidemiologists, physicians interviewed every day who are asked to rate things. And you'll hear 4 or 5 of them talk about the same thing and rate it with a different level of risk. And that's because it's different for each person. So you have to know your tolerance level, and you have to know the context that you're working in. When you identify the risks for yourself, you then have to prioritize them. And when I say define a mitigation or a management strategy, what we're really talking about there is how will you make it work for you? Think of what those things are. So again, I'll use my own self as an example. I had delayed and deferred some medical appointments. And as things seemed to be getting better, I thought, well, I should be able to handle this. Doesn't mean I wasn't feeling anxious or nervous, but I identified everything that I could do, including walking up the steps to a 6th floor office to see the doctor that I needed to see, because I didn't want to be in the elevator with people in a confined space. So that was a mitigation or a management strategy for myself. It worked for me. I carried out that fix. I came back home and I actually felt pretty good. good enough to make another appointment and not to have that same level of anxiety. As we tiptoe out and we validate that certain fixes are working for us, it doesn't mean the risk has disappeared. It means we found that that risk is tolerable for us. And that's an important difference to engage and manage as you go forth again through the pandemic. Sometimes things are going to fall apart. Sometimes we're not going to be able to handle it. Sometimes our own previous history may be re-triggered, as Larry's going to talk about, and we'll need to seek help. These are just some of the cues that you might look at in yourself. Anxiety, irritability, flashbacks to other times, reliving trauma, as I said earlier, beginning to relapse, feeling spaced out, and when your daily function is affected. Those are times you want to reach out for more significant help, not necessarily just the help of a friend, but perhaps a therapist, an agency, and so on. The bottom line is your mental health is the foundation from which a healthy and rewarding life really do grow. So again, it's your physical, emotional, cognitive health, relationships, and a sense of purpose that really will breed your well-being and build your well-being. I like to say when the vision of who you are is consistent and aligned with the values, beliefs that you strive to uphold, when those align in turn with your own personal strengths and you take action to keep moving you forward, relying on living true to that vision, using those values and strengths, you work. When these work, you work. And that's where I'm going to leave you. And I'm going to throw it back to Rabbi Egger, and hopefully that'll go easy. There we go.
Thank you so much. That was really, really enlightening and really helpful. And I know that there's some questions. We're going to get to those questions in just a few minutes, particularly Ricki for some of the things that you've raised. But I would really like to have Larry share a little bit, especially with his expertise in trauma and healing from trauma, which is something that you mentioned a lot about, Ricki, about the big traumas, T, and the little traumas that all add up to challenge us during this time. So Larry, thank you so much for being here and for sharing from your perspective.
Thank you, Rabbi. I've been a proud member, I want to say I've been a proud member of Kol Ami for 15 years. And I have found it really has been a great resource through the couple of months we've been in the pandemic. I find that I'm going to services much more often than I was when I had to drive there. So let me see if I can pull this up. I'm glad to see a number of friends here, even though I can't see you. So just a preview of what I'm going to be covering. Most importantly, to always remember, we are resilient beings. You have been through a lot. Human beings put up with a lot of challenges, and your ancestors and your parents and grandparents have been through a lot, and it's always important to remember how strong we really are. I'm going to be covering how, with the pandemic and anxieties surrounding the pandemic, old issues may be showing up. And that being the case, how do we protect our happiness, our equanimity, and even our grace? And not to forget our sense of humor. How we can work with anxiety, sleeplessness. Look, Ricki talked a lot about sleep being so important. And I have some tips for that. What to watch out for when you might want to seek outside help. And then I have a small section on community resources. As the rabbi said, I specialize in trauma. I would like to talk about in this presentation how past traumas may be activated by the pandemic and some of the things we're going through. So we've been in the shutdown and we've spent a lot of time at home and watching Netflix, and we might be fooled to think that things are just fine until we go out to the supermarket or walk on the street and see people in masks. And for a month or so before the pandemic, we were witnessing what was going on in China and Italy. I don't know about you, but the rapidity with which the shutdown happened kind of blindsided me, and how quickly infections were going up in New York and here in LA. We're also dealing with a lot of information that's being disputed from different sides of the political spectrum. It's hard to know. There's confusion about what's true, what's not true. We may feel like nobody's in charge. In this period, we're isolated by friends and loved ones. I was talking to the rabbi earlier about how it's very difficult for me to visit my 99-year-old mother and feel that she's safe. And that's been one of the hardest things for me. So we're isolated from friends and loved ones, and at the same time, we're hunkered down with family or by ourselves, and that presents its own difficulty. Lots of us have been put in financial instability, wondering where our finances are going to be in the near future, and also observing friends that are having difficulty with their finances. Always good to remember that there is a post-COVID life that awaits us. So with all those things going on, if you are experiencing confusion, anxiety, overwhelm, a jumpy nervous system, cabin fever, activation of old traumas, sluggishness, then you're right in step with most everybody. Those are appropriate responses to a pandemic. So I want to talk a little bit about how old traumas can be activated. There's two kinds of traumas I want to talk about. They come in two flavors. One is developmental trauma, just growing up, what kind of things you dealt with as a child. Were you bullied? Were you an adopted child, a gay child, the only Jewish kid in the school like I was? And that would be developmental trauma. And then also particularly relevant to Jewish folks is intergenerational trauma, where we have the history of the Holocaust, whether our relatives were in it or not, somehow in our bones. So with the pandemic, if you grew up being bullied as a child, or you isolated as a child, this might bring back some of those memories, some of those feelings of being isolated. It might also bring up memories of the AIDS crisis. The riots, the LA riots back in 90, whatever it was, happened right around my place. And when the looting happened, that brought up a lot of my old traumas from that. So one way of approaching this is to remember that if it brings up memories of being isolated as a child, to really note that it's a different situation now. A child doesn't really have many options. And a child who's hiding out because of being bullied is kind of victimized. But in this case, it's good to really notice that you're choosing to protect yourself. You're staying home to protect yourself from a pandemic, and you're choosing to protect others, reminding yourself that you have options.
Larry?
Yes.
It's Rabbi Chaikin. I'm going to ask you, I think you are looking at your slides, but you didn't share your screen yet, I think. So
oh, thank you.
I know that some of us, some of our folks are visual learners too, and would love to see what you're working with.
I appreciate that. Let me get that done somehow. Did that work, Max?
There you go. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
So just talking about finishing up here with activation of past traumas, just to reframe it and remember that these situations are different. In terms of, I've had a couple of clients who the sheltering at home actually has brought back feelings of the Holocaust, and it brought up a little bit of my feelings of that as well. And to remember, this is not 1940. Look out the window. Let your body know. Let your senses see that we're not back there. And these are not those times. And it might take reminding yourself a few times. But these issues can run in our bones, in our blood. So other ways of dealing with traumas that show up are recalling past challenges and successes that you've had, degrees that you've earned. For those who had difficulties as a child, it may be some of the most difficult days of your life, and yet you managed that and succeeded it and have grown into adulthood and learned from those experiences. Recalling positive relationships where you've been mentored, where you've been loved and cared for. Cultivating presence, which means connecting with your senses. Curiosity. When we're feeling threat, we tend to focus on whatever it is that's threatening us. And if we have a dog that's on our heels, that's pretty much all we can see. Curiosity is kind of the opposite of trauma. It allows us to look around and see things, take in things of beauty, ask questions about them. So if you can look around your room with curiosity or outside with curiosity and allow yourself to see things that you haven't noticed before, it's a way of opening your experience, opening your focus. Like I was saying about Kol Ami, spiritual practice, Kol Ami has been a great resource for me. Choosing what friends, Ricki was mentioning this as well. What friends are resources to us? What friends bring us positive energy, family members, and are there books that inspire you? Or sayings? Music, exercise, pets, walking in nature are always good resources. You might want to keep a list of support contacts, people that you can contact if you're feeling low, people that inspire you, teachers. And just to point out, health doesn't just happen, and good attitudes don't just happen. It takes effort, focus, and action to protect our happiness, equanimity, and grace. So the pandemic also challenges our social styles. Extroverts who are sheltered in place can't extrovert as they're used to doing, and going out to movies and parties and things like that. And introverts face another challenge, and that is that they don't have a tendency to reach out at a period of time when it's really important to reach out. And a question that I try to ask myself when I find myself in difficult situations or difficult relationships is, what's here for me? What does this situation offer me to learn? And in this case, for the extroverts, they might learn to focus inward. This is a good time to develop meditation skills, to look inward for resources rather than outside. And for introverts, it gives them or you an opportunity to be more proactive and to seek out the socialization that you need. So you want to take care of your nervous system. The nervous system is where, when your nervous system is out of whack a bit, it brings up a lot of anxiety. It's difficult to relax. And the nervous system loves structure. Your brain may not love structure, but the nervous system does. So if you schedule your sleep, I'm only telling you this, not that I do it, but studies show that if you structure the time you go to sleep, that can help improve your sleep patterns. And Ricki was talking about how important good sleep is to good mental health and good physical health. There's a whole area of research called sleep hygiene, and the basics of it are that you pick a time to go to bed and you give yourself 8 or 9 hours, the amount of time that's good for you. Half an hour or so before you go to bed, you turn off your electronics, you brush your teeth, you put on your sleep clothes, and you basically prepare your body to go to sleep. And you can find this on the internet. There's a lot of information about sleep hygiene and sleeping better. I have another way of scheduling my week is I've set up weekly FaceTime calls with my mother and my sister, which has been great for me to stay in contact with her, and it's been wonderful for her, and she's actually enjoying the technology. I'm doing 3 times a week meditation sittings with a few other people, and it's been great for my relationship, and they've kept me steady in my practice. I'm doing daily walks, and I try to pick the same time to go for walks just to put some structure into my day. And like I said earlier, I've been attending Kol Ami services much more than I was when I was going there in person. All that said, some warning signs you might look out for, and Ricki had also mentioned this. So if you find that you are, there's a change in your eating habits, that you're gaining or losing a fair bit of weight, if you find yourself acting out, which would be acting out would be overeating, doing things that are risky. If you find yourself acting in, like starting to drink more, if you find a substantial drop in your energy or concentration, very important, if you find a diminishment in the amount of pleasure you get in things. We're all isolating, but if you find that you're even isolating more and you're not reaching out at all, thoughts of sickness or death, definitely suicidal thoughts, then it's time to reach out for help. You might talk to friends and tell them what you're experiencing, get an outside opinion from someone you trust. And these are some resources you can use. Kol Ami is a great resource. Rabbi Edgar has been a great resource for me for therapists and other professionals. The LGBT Center, you might want to take a screenshot of this. Southern California Counseling Center has sliding scale therapy sessions available. There's the suicide hotline, teen line, Al-Anon for people who have close relatives or friends that are alcoholic, who can be disruptive. That's a lot of us. Not the disruptive part, but friends like that, family like that. Jewish Family Service Center also has sliding scale therapy, where I used to work. And the best name of the week, I think, is this ichill.com, which has a lot of information about regulating the nervous system, some of the stuff that I covered earlier. And there's this great meditation timer called Insight Timer, and you can set it up to take a 20-minute meditation, and it'll start and end with a gong. And there's also some guided meditations. And one thing I kind of liked about that, when I use it for meditation, it tells you who else in the world is meditating with you. And for some reason, I was really getting a kick out of that. And lastly, if you want to find a therapist, how might you do that? Friends and family are a great resource. The temple, your doctor, and I think a great way to find a therapist is to ask a friend of yours who's a therapist. Most therapists, almost all therapists, will not see their friends. So, and most therapists know quite a few. So that's a good way to get a good referral. If you find someone you think might be a good therapist, almost all of them will speak to you for, and they'll probably do it on Zoom these days, speak to you for 10, 20 minutes at no charge, just so you can get a sense of what it would be like to work with them. Also, Psychology Today and Yelp have list of therapists. And something to remember, if you're looking for a heart surgeon, it's going to be hard to judge, for you to judge who's a great heart surgeon. You might want to look at reviews, or you might want to talk to other MDs. But in terms of a therapist, it really has so much to do with the relationship between you and the therapist. So you really are the best judge. If you talk to a therapist, and you should really feel that it's a good match. If you have an intuitive sense that it's a good match, you're a good judge of that. So my favorite saying these days is really relevant to the pandemic, and I'm going to end on this, and that is, what lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. So it really goes back to what we want, what we choose to do, and what individual strengths we've created and choices that we've made. So thanks for joining us this evening. Thank you, rabbis.
Thank you so much, Larry. This is really spectacular to put a framework around some of these traumas and what we can do to help improve ourselves. And as Ricki would put it in a context earlier, of help grow during this time. And so I want to take a time to say thank you to both of you for sharing your expertise. But I want to turn now to those of you, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A, and invite anybody else who has been thinking about or struggling with an issue and that can be more generalized. We don't want to do your specific therapeutic issue tonight, but what we want to do is talk about things that might have resonance for all of us during this time. And Larry, I was particularly struck with your description about this difficulties for people who are extroverts on the one hand while we're quarantining in place, because those that are extroverts don't have necessarily all of the folks around that you kind of thrive off of, and also the reverse for those that are introverts who may like the nesting and like the internal part. Even for introverts, it might be too quiet as well, and then that adds to that withdrawal and isolation as we now have to especially try to re-entry. I'm going to kick us off, and then we're going to go to the questions. Is maybe both of you can share a little bit about this re-entry a little bit. I don't know, I'll just say personally, I know I've become a little bit agoraphobic. I'm worried about people wearing masks or not wearing masks, about going to grocery stores. I've tried to have a test out. How do I feel? I went to Costco for the first time at senior hours the other day, and it was, even though it was senior hours, it was very well done and the carts were disinfected. It was very nervous making for me. So maybe, I don't think I'm alone in that. So maybe we could talk for just a couple of minutes about the re-entry as society is beginning to open up, and how do we figure out how to manage that anxiety from the safety of our apartments, and two, how do we manage it to get back into living our fullness of our lives before there's a vaccine?
And who knows how long?
And who knows how long? Yes.
Well, I'm like you.
Go ahead.
I'm like you. I'm very careful. I have some compromised issues with my lungs. I do not want to get this. Yeah, we all have to decide on our own risk. I go to stores very early. I feel like they get kind of dirty as the day goes on, and most of my clients are being very cautious.
I will kind of take the question too, at a personal level, and then trying to be also more objective about it. As I said in the slide, we all have to really focus in on how we deal with risk, our own risk. And everybody's risk factors will be different, and everybody's risk tolerance will be different. One ER physician I spoke with recently said right now, with things reopening, he feels safer in the hospital than he does out in public. And I think, that can be taken as you just both did, oh, wow. But I think it's also a comment on the safety practices of the places you go. So what's the context? The first time I went to a farmer's market, I thought I was doing everything right. And then I made a mistake while I was there because I handled some cash and I switched from the gloved hand to the ungloved hand. And that night I went home and I couldn't sleep. And the next morning I was sure I was going to come down with COVID and I was going to die. And I finally said to myself by about noon the day after, Ricki, this is crazy. You can ruin the next 2 weeks worrying, or you can just go on and see what happens, knowing that going forward, you know how to rectify the mistake that you made. And so I think it's like, learning to swim. You dip your toe in the water, you see what it feels like, and if you don't feel okay, you don't do it again. But if you do feel like, I made it through, it wasn't as bad, and you keep looking at what are the practices I need to engage to keep me comfortable. Mm-hmm. Like Larry, I have risk factors. Rabbi, you may have your own. But we all have to gauge where we're going to live with this, because the chances of it going away soon are not great. And even if there's a vaccine, I'm not in a place to scientifically comment on it, but as a layperson who gets a flu shot every year, that flu shot isn't always a match. And so the vaccine may work well, it may work a little bit less than well, it may only work for a few months, we may have to be revaccinated. We don't even know what it's going to mean. So for now to go out there again means defining your life as full using a different set of standards. A full life for me used to mean I had dinners out with friends. It meant I visited friends. It meant I traveled. I'm not doing a lot of those things, but that doesn't mean I haven't filled it with other things that have meaning.
Well said.
I think it's a very good point about that learning to reshape what fullness of life means, and I think that's a really good thing. This is a related question that somebody asked about, and it is about this reentry issue. As things have opened up to a large extent, I'm anxious to realize that my ability to reintegrate out in the world is dependent upon other people to follow good protocol, and the control I felt of my own health has been lost because clearly many people are not being careful. So I feel much more at risk and insecure about ever getting out again. How do I manage that stress when it's medically valid to avoid the public? So maybe we could talk about the stress management here.
Larry, you want to go? You want me to go?
Be my guest.
Okay. I think, stress management is just what it is. It's stress management. And again, you make the determination of what are your essential things, what are your non-essentials, but high up on the list of what you want to do, incorporate, engage with, and recognize where the risks will be as you go out there. As I said during my talk, I had delayed some medical stuff. Now, to me, getting in an elevator, closed space with people who are potentially ill doesn't sound like something I want to do. So I am reasonably fit. I chose to walk up the 6th floor. And next week, I'll probably walk up to the 15th floor of a tower. I may have to take a little longer to do it and stop to catch my breath, but that's the way I handle that risk. I don't go out every day thinking, I'm in trouble here. I see people and I say to myself, whoops, here comes somebody not wearing a mask. I'm going to the other side of the street. In my home, my spouse is a little bit younger than I am and isn't as high risk, and does become the person who goes to the store much more often than I do. I think I've been in a store 2 times. Now that may shift as health factors shift for each of us, but you just have to keep looking at this as a dynamic. It's not a static piece, and each day you may remake a decision that you made the day before.
And anxiety might be a good response when people don't take care of themselves, and they don't, and they put you at risk.
Well, and anxiety and all of these emotional responses are healthy responses unless they're getting in the way of our life. So, if my anxiety makes me more aware of my own health practices, that's not a bad thing, right? But if my anxiety says, oh, Ricki, now, and to use your word, Denise, I'm 100% agoraphobic. I'm never going out. Everything has to be delivered before it comes into the house. We're wiping it all down. My shoes come off. If I am in a panicky sense about that, my anxiety is now dysfunctional.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Julia asks, how do I deal with some of the pseudoscience that's out there, the natural remedies, natural healing for these things, or conspiracy theories about things that are on it? How do they deal with that?
Well, that's a tough question. There's so much of that out there.
It's hard to sort through
It sometimes, isn't it?
Well, I saw they interviewed 500 epidemiologists the other day, and they wrote an article about it, about what they thought they rated, going to a hair salon,
right.
going to a movie theater. I found that really, really helpful. I guess what I'm saying is choose your articles well. There is so much pseudoscience out there, and bad science.
And to piggyback on that, Larry, is that there's always been pseudoscience, and there's always been conspiracy theories about any number of things. So how have you previously figured out what will I attend to and what will I dismiss? The pseudoscience is always going to be there. And even the epidemiology study, I saw the same one, and they asked, what will you do in 3 months? What will you do in 6? What will you do in a year? And the answers were all over the place. There's no agreement because there isn't enough information. As much information as we have right now, there's still a lot more that we need.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. And I, when we see pictures of people out and about, and we watch the news, and we see people sitting in a restaurant, and we might have feelings of jealousy because I want to be in a restaurant, but then also the feelings of fear about going into the restaurant in the first place. But as we see more pictures of people doing it, it also sometimes wears down our own resolve to care, to do the self-care that we need, especially if we have a particular complicating set of underlying issues. So, it does take a level of vigilance, I think, for all of us, and to surround ourselves, even if it's in a Zoom room, a community of people who share your values. And I think that's another important piece, particularly in this time of shelter in place. Carly asks, I'm doing nothing all day and yet I'm exhausted. I know stress can be tiring, but I struggle to be kind to myself when I feel I'm not at my best productivity wise, even when my schedule is so clear. Can you address one more time, maybe a little bit about some of these steps that we might be able to do and things we might be able to do to manage that?
Larry, you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I do think I said in my talk that setting up a schedule is very helpful for that. If you're not getting exercise and not getting out at all, that can end up being exhausting. I'm really lucky that I see clients many days, so I do have human contact. And I think you really have to make efforts to keep up your sociability, and I think that will give you more energy.
Yeah, I also think that we don't realize how much emotional energy of any type is spent unconsciously. You know, you think you're sitting and relaxing, but your brain hasn't shut off. You know, I notoriously in my house, it's, oh, she took a shower. What is she going to come out here with new ideas on what now? And, you know, I thought the shower was relaxing. So there are any number of competing pieces going on. You just because you're out exercising and you should be just focused on that doesn't mean somebody will be. And so I think in terms of trying to move from that depleted state into a more energized state also takes a lot of mindfulness, a lot of learning to be present, to be here, to be with whatever it is you're doing, and not give yourself, I want to say, criticism, but rather compassion, because it is more tiring to be in a home environment all the time where, you know, you look up and you see the shelf that you should have arranged differently, or the floor that still needs cleaning and dusting. And yet you just want to sit there and watch TV tonight, you know? So as much as we think we're not using our energy, it is going to these other things, and they are exhausting. So again, be kind to yourself.
And I would just add to that, for those of us, my days are pretty full. I don't have. I wish I could do what other people are doing and Marie Kondoize my my life and weed things out. I don't even have time to do those projects. But I am on Zoom. I am on these kinds of seminars and webinars and teaching all day and meetings all day, and they're exhausting in a different way than an in-person meeting. And I've actually noticed physical issues. My eyes are drier. They need more time to relax. We don't have the social cues. We're used to reading body language when we're in a group. You don't necessarily have all of that when you're in this kind of virtual environment, whether on Google Hangouts or Google Meetups or Facebook meetings or Zoom meetings. So that also adds to our exhaustion. So if you're someone who is dealing with a lot of telemed or meetings on computer face-to-face, that leads another level of exhaustion and takes a lot of self-care. And I think that's the thing that I've learned a lot in this last 13 weeks of being at home, is that we can't ignore the self-care. And I just want to again thank Dr. Ricki Bander and Larry Levi for this incredible opportunity to really stop and pause and think about that our well-being isn't just about our physicality, but it is about our emotional and spiritual and mental well-being. And in fact, they go hand in hand. When Jews pray, we thank God in the morning for our working bodies. We say, thank you, God, for all of the veins and the fine network of our bodies, and we pray that they'll work right. And we also thank God for our spirits and our souls and the breath that God breathed into us, and that we together they make up the well-being of a human. And so you've reminded us today about that spirit and that soul, and our mental well-being is just as important as any physical exercise and sleep that we do. So thank you both so much. I want to thank all of you for being with us tonight here at Congregation Kol Ami, and ask that you consider making a donation to kol-ami.org in honor of Ricki and Larry for sharing their expertise with each of us to continue to support the work that we're doing and helping sustain you during this time of shelter in place until we find a cure and a vaccine. Tomorrow at noon, I'll be teaching an online lunch and learn class on race and justice. You can register again at the Kol Ami website, kol-ami.org. Friday night, we are celebrating Juneteenth, an important American holiday of emancipation from slavery, and we will have special words from Bishop Yvette Flunder, who is the founder and pastor of City of Refuge Church in Oakland, California, and a bishop with United Church of Christ. She's an incredible speaker and preacher, and she'll be with Kol Ami. This weekend is HIV support, our tour studies class, and Sunday at 4 p.m., another installment of Broadway Showstoppers with Glenn Rosenblum about musical theaters from Sending the Clowns to Mame, so I know you don't want to miss that. And next Tuesday night, we have a great workshop on LGBT asylees and refugees and what's happening, especially in this time of COVID-19. And then next Thursday night, another installment of these health updates with Dr. Aaron Aronell on dealing with the healthcare system in the time of COVID-19. So he's an incredible neurologist and HIV/AIDS specialist, and he'll be is on faculty at USC and at Desert AIDS Project in Palm Springs. So he'll have a lot to share with us about navigating the healthcare system while we're in this COVID-19 time. Again, thank you, Ricki. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Rabbi Chaikin, for always the behind-the-scenes work that you do. And thank you to everyone for being here. If you'd like to watch this again, it will be posted on the Kol Ami YouTube channel and our website. So if you want to come back to any of the great wisdom and advice and counsel that Ricki and Larry gave us, you'll be able to find it there at kol-ami.org. Thanks again, and have a good evening. Erev Tov, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.